Got one from Zero Hedge. Worse than you think, 8 reality checks from last week's Congressional Budget Office report. Authored by Daniel Nevins via ffwiley.com through Zero Hedge. For what they're worth, and for anyone who doesn't mind digging through the weeds, here are my comments on last week's budget outlook from the Congressional Budget Office, which I previewed here, which he links. In the baseline scenario that's widely reported in the media, I'll abbreviate it BS for this post, the CBO shows federal debt held by the public soaring from 76% of GDP at fiscal year end 2017, get ready for this, to 96% of GDP at the end of the 10-year forecast horizon in 2028. I got news for you. This is Jay Snip talking. It'll be there far sooner than 2028. Number 2, the CBO also restored its alternative scenario, which adjusts for certain constraints on what it's legally allowed to include in the BS, making it more realistic than the BS. Unfortunately, the alternative scenario didn't appear in annual reports between 2014 and 2017. In those years, the CBO highlighted areas where the BS projections were likely to be wrong, but without producing an alternative. Even though it gets only a fraction of the attention given the BS, it's good to see the alternative scenario is actually back. It shows debt held by the public rising to 105% of GDP by the end of 2028, compared to the baseline 96% of GDP. Now, I'm trying to go back on some of my memories here from a few years ago, and I'm pretty sure that the real numbers are that we are already past 100% of GDP, debt to GDP in this country. Like, I'm pretty sure I found data already that shows we're already there, not 10 years from now. But I'm not going to go dig for it right now. I'm going to finish reading this article. But as the alternative scenario is also optimistic, partly because it uses the same rosy economic assumptions as the BS, and partly because it includes less emergency spending than the BS. Number 4, as for the economic assumptions, the CBO's unemployment rate projections are lower than they were last year in every projection year. They show an average unemployment rate for the next 10 years of 4.4%, which is almost a third lower than the 6.2% historical average over the past 40 years, and at least 0.4% lower than in any other 10-year projection the CBO has ever produced. Number 5, for perspective, consider that the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows only one historical 10-year period during which the average unemployment rate was as low as the CBO projects today. That one period was from 1948 to 1957, when the unemployment rate averaged 4.4%, as in the CBO's current projection, but it's hard to imagine the average would have been that low had the Korean War not pushed unemployment firmly below 4% for 35 consecutive months. Number 6, for still more perspective, the CBO recently analyzed its forecasting record and discovered that its revenue projections for 5 years into the future average 1.7% of GDP, more than actual outcomes after adjusting for tax law changes. That is, the CBO's average revenue forecasting error was an overestimate of 1.7% of GDP. Why the huge errors? In other words, they're explained mostly by the difficulty of predicting when economic downturns will occur. Yet the CBO followed that revelation by continuing to lower its unemployment rate projections, unemployment rate projections to all-time low records in last week's report, and by persisting with its practice of not including a genuine recession in its outlook. As I discussed last week, it includes only a tiny recession allowance, and I neglected to mention that the allowance doesn't take effect until the forecast period's back half. Number 7, as for emergency spending, I've suggested increasing the CBO spending projections by an average of figure for bailouts, economic stimulus packages, and supplemental appropriations, although adjusted for whatever spending in those 3 categories found its way into the particular year's BS by being appropriated in the short window between the start of the fiscal year and the compilation of the CBO's annual outlook. I've suggested an unexpected spending allowance of about 0.5% of GDP based on historical data beginning in 1980, but this year is different. with just over $100 billion in natural disaster funding having found its way into the BS and $100 billion being about 0.5% of GDP, my adjustment isn't necessarily this year. In other words, the BS includes a typical amount of emergency spending, which in this instance happens to be skewed almost entirely to disaster relief. The problem, though, is in the AS, or the alternative scenario. For the AS, the CBO removed almost all of the current fiscal year's $100 billion in emergency spending from future years because it considers that spending atypical. That may seem reasonable on the surface, but the CBO defines emergency spending too narrowly. It does not allow that the future will surely bring bailouts, economic stimulus packages, and other types of unexpected appropriations that don't meet its restrictive definition. As noted above, $100 billion for the 2018 fiscal year isn't unusual. It's about the average amount for unexpected appropriations in any given year, going all the way back to 1980. Building a more realistic debt outlook, with all of that in mind, I would say we can build a more realistic debt outlook by 1, starting with the AS, or the alternative scenario, 2, adding a moderate recession during the 10-year forecast period, and 3, putting $100 billion in annual unexpected spending back into the projection. As noted above, the AS shows federal debt held by the public reaching 105% in 2028 of GDP. Now let's add the moderate recession by tweaking the unemployment rate. Here's a picture showing what might happen to the unemployment rate if the economy dips into recession in 2020 to 2021 and then recovers and expands from 2022 to 2028, which I'm not going to show you. And here are the 10-year averages for the CBO projection versus with recession scenario. Note that the 1950s and 1960s troughs were depressed by conscription during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, which makes them largely irrelevant as a guide to current times. As you can see, I'm not exactly projecting an economic collapse by allowing the unemployment rate to reach 6.3% in 2020 to 2021 recession. From the current rate of 4.1%, an increase to 6.3 matches the average increase from the past 10 recessions. And estimating the budgetary effects of that increase is fairly easy, thanks to a sensitivity analysis the CBO included in its 2016 annual outlook. Essentially, by drawing from all the CBO's published data, we can remove the dream economy from its debt scenario and replace it with an economy that better matches the real world. If we then also accept that 2018's $100 billion in unexpected spending represents a normal amount, we get the following alternative scenario. And instead of the 96% GDP, debt to GDP ratio, it's 113% debt to GDP ratio. It looks like it would be at 100% by 2023, maybe. To be sure, my 2028 figure of 113% of GDP is just an estimate. In his conclusion, judging by what you read and hear in the mainstream media, the CBO is an absolute authority on all things government debt. It's independent, nonpartisan, and full of experts on economics and budgeting. When it tells us debt will reach 96% of GDP in 10 years' time, as in the baseline scenario that dominates media coverage, that's the figure we can rely on. But in fact, reality does not match the reputation. Sure, the CBO's experts know the ins and outs of governmental budgeting, and they're almost certainly good people. I'm not calling them idiots and liars, by the way, he says. But they're human. They're beholden to other humans. They work in an institution created by humans, and all of that means they operate under constraints and biases. They face fierce political pressure from a Congress that wants to be seen as fiscally responsible, even though it's anything but. They face equally fierce pressure, peer pressure that is, from trained economists who insist on head-in-the-sand forecasting methods. They have to abide by governing statutes that invite a variety of lawmaking shenanigans. And finally, they're surely reluctant to be the bearers of bad news for reputation and advancement in their career. It's better to be idealistic and then explain later what you got wrong. Kind of like Bernanke, we did not see this coming. None of us saw this coming. Our expert didn't see this coming. And quite a few people were like, we all saw this coming. We all warned this about it, the housing problem. We warned you when it was happening. We warned you before that when you started to deregulate. And now you're saying no one saw it coming, right? Again, they saw it coming. They knew it was coming, but they were not allowed to ever say it was coming or they'd be gone the next day, fired, replacement. So then, what was the old saying? It's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And that is the way the government rolls. Take care.